Ever run into one of those mysteries that just seems completely impossible, where the pieces just refuse to fit together?
Yeah, like a jigsaw puzzle where someone swapped out half the pieces for ones from a totally different picture.
That's a great way to put it. And that's kind of what we're diving into today, a real head-scratcher of a case. Picture this. You're in Hummelstown, Pennsylvania, a seemingly quiet town. 82-year-old Catherine Bishop has been brutally attacked in her home. But here's the thing. The detail that throws everything off, the only broken glass at the crime scene was on the outside of the side door.
So it's like someone broke out instead of in.
Exactly. It's like the crime scene is flipped on its head.
That's bizarre.
It is. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. No signs of forced entry, nothing stolen. Initially, no witnesses, just a whole lot of confusion.
I can see how this one could have easily become a cold case.
Oh, absolutely. But it didn't. And that's what makes this case so fascinating. Because through some really incredible forensic work, investigators were able to piece together what happened. And the way they did it is, well, it's pretty surprising.
So we're talking about a case where the tiniest details ended up being the key, the kind of stuff most people would probably overlook.
You got it. And today, we're going to walk through exactly how they did it, drawing from the Forensic Files episode, A Case of the Flue. Get ready for some serious aha moments because the way this investigation unfolded is anything but straightforward.
All right, I'm ready to dive in. Let's start with the basics. What did the scene look like when investigators first arrived?
Okay, so it all starts when a city employee notices Catherine Bishop's damaged side door. He's the one who calls it in. You can only imagine the shock and grief for Catherine's daughter when she arrived to find emergency services already at her mom's house.
Awful.
Absolutely. And inside, the scene was, as you can imagine, pretty grim. Catherine had been severely beaten. There was a significant amount of blood. Tragically, there were also defensive wounds on her arms. She even had a broken fingernail, suggesting she put up a fight.
She didn't go down without a fight.
No, she didn't. She is found in the living room with a crossword puzzle sitting there, unfinished, and a broken pen in her hand.
Wow. So she was just going about her day when this happened. That's chilling. It really drives home the suddenness and the brutality of the attack.
Doesn't it? And to add to the mystery, as I mentioned earlier, nothing was stolen. No signs of ransacking at all.
So if it wasn't a robbery, what was the motive?
That was the big question. And then you have the medical examiner who estimated the time of death to be between 9 and 10:30 p.m. the night before. But like we were saying before, the most perplexing thing was that broken glass, all on the outside of that side door.
Right, like someone was desperately trying to get out. But if that was the exit, how did they get in? And why break the glass if you're trying to be discreet? It just doesn't add up.
It really doesn't. But then there's a small break in the case. A neighbor who was out walking her dog around 10:30 that night reported seeing a shadowy figure running from Catherine's house.
Okay, so that supports the estimated time of death and suggests someone did indeed leave in a hurry, but it still doesn't tell us how they got in.
True. And this is where the medical examiner's meticulous work really comes into play. They went beyond just determining the cause of death and started looking for microscopic clues.
It's amazing how often those tiny details end up making all the difference.
It really is. And in this case, the autopsy revealed the truly horrific extent of the attack. Catherine had been struck over 60 times.
Oh my gosh.
It's just awful. The cause of death was determined to be a suffocation from multiple broken ribs, which prevented her from breathing. But what's really interesting here is what the medical examiner found using clear tape.
Oh yeah, that's standard procedure, right?
Yeah.
To lift any potential trace evidence.
Right. And it usually yields some pretty interesting stuff. But in this case, it was pivotal. They discovered two things. First, a fiber that didn't match any of Catherine's clothing.
Suggesting another person was present.
Exactly. And even more intriguing, a tiny chip of white paint was found in Catherine's hand.
A fiber and a paint chip. Sounds pretty insignificant.
You'd think so, wouldn't you? But in the hands of a skilled forensic analyst, these seemingly minor details can tell a powerful story.
So let's start with that paint chip. What did they find out about it?
Well, forensic analyst John Evans takes a look at this tiny paint chip, and he notices something. It's not just one layer of paint, it's actually three distinct layers. A white top layer, a yellow middle layer, and a tannish bottom layer.
Okay, so it's kind of like a paint sandwich.
Yeah, exactly. And here's where it gets really interesting. Evans compares this layered chip to paint samples from all over Catherine's house. And guess what? It only matched the paint around her basement window.
Okay, so we've got a match. But how does a paint chip from the basement window end up in Catherine's hand?
Mm.
And what about that mysterious entry point?
Well, remember that basement window? It was about 4.5 feet off the ground.
Mhm.
And when investigators checked the siding underneath, they found black marks. It looked like someone had climbed up to reach the window.
So someone climbed up to the basement window, got inside, attacked Catherine, and then scrambled out the side door, breaking the glass in the process.
That's the picture that's starting to emerge. And remember those fabric impressions found on the washing machine? Well, they look like they could have been made by denim jeans.
Further supporting the idea that someone was down there.
Right. They also found some partial finger and palm prints, but they were unfortunately too smudged to be useful at that stage of the investigation.
Okay, so we've got a possible entry point. We've got some trace evidence. What's the next step? How do they figure out who was in that basement?
Well, naturally, investigators started by putting together a list of anyone who had been in Catherine's house recently. This included a fuel oil delivery, but the company confirmed the driver never even went inside and had an alibi for that night.
So the oil delivery guy's off the hook. Who else was there?
They found a receipt for a chimney cleaning service.
Ah, so that's where our chimney sweep suspects come in.
Exactly. 27-year-old Tim McAnany and his 20-year-old cousin, Andrew Richmond, they had been at the house that afternoon to clean the chimney. And get this, Catherine's daughter was actually home at the time and spoke to them.
So they had a window of opportunity to case the place, see what Catherine's routine was like.
Right. And the daughter remembered the cost of the service, a little over $300, which will be important later. But at this point, it seems like a dead end because McAnany and Richmond had an alibi for the night of the murder. They said they went straight from Catherine's house to a nearby bar where they stayed until after 1 a.m.
Okay, so a seemingly solid alibi backed up by other people at the bar. Case closed.
Not so fast. Catherine's daughter remembered something else, something that made her uneasy. She'd seen 3 rolls of cash, about $6,000, in a basket on the dining room table that afternoon. Money that Catherine used for groceries and such.
And she was concerned about the chimney sweeps knowing about it.
Very concerned. She actually even told her mother to put the money away because she wasn't comfortable with strangers knowing it was there. Smart lady. And I bet that cash was missing when the police searched the house.
You bet it was. Gone without a trace. And then things get even more interesting. A confidential source comes forward and speaks to a journalist, Pete Shell.
Ooh, a confidential source. This is getting juicy.
It is. This source claims that McAnany and Richmond actually made a little side trip that night to Atlantic City. Atlantic City, home of casinos, and a prime spot to spend a sudden windfall of cash.
Right. So now that seemingly airtight alibi is starting to look a little shaky.
Especially if that cash from Catherine's house is suddenly burning a hole in their pockets.
Exactly. And when investigators took a closer look at their alibi, it started to crumble even further. The bartender's accounts didn't quite match up. One bartender remembers them sitting next to her at one point, but another places them in a completely different part of the bar later on.
So they weren't exactly glued to their seats all night.
Nope. Plus, Catherine's house wasn't far from the bar at all, maybe a 30-minute drive, so it would have been entirely possible to slip out, go to Catherine's, commit the crime, and get back to the bar without anyone noticing.
Enough time to commit a crime and try to establish an alibi.
That's the theory. So now investigators have a possible motive, a shaky alibi, and a window of opportunity. It was time to take a closer look at those chimney sweeps.
And I'm guessing those clothes they were wearing that night became pretty important.
Oh, absolutely. They got a warrant and searched McAnany and Richmond's homes, confiscating the clothes they were wearing at the bar that night. And remember that fiber they found on Catherine's body?
The one that didn't match any of her clothes.
That's the one. Well, the Pennsylvania State Police forensic team analyzed it and determined that it matched fibers from McAnany's black t-shirt.
Okay, so now we've got a direct link placing McAnany at the scene of the crime. Pretty damning evidence.
It was. But as you can imagine, the defense team wasn't going to take that lying down. They hired their own trace evidence expert, Skip Polinick, to review the findings.
Now, Skip Polinick, he's a big name in forensics, right?
Huge. He's incredibly respected in the field. So initially, when the defense brought him in, it caused some concern for the prosecution.
Understandably. Bringing in an expert like that could really shake things up.
You'd think so, right? But here's the twist. Polinick's analysis didn't contradict the state police findings at all.
So no bombshell reveal.
Nope. In fact, he confirmed them. Polinick's examination found both synthetic and natural black fibers from McAnany's t-shirt that matched those found on Catherine.
Well, that shuts down any argument about faulty lab work or bias. But I'm guessing McCanny had a counter-argument up his sleeve.
He did. He argued that the fibers didn't actually prove anything. He'd been inside Catherine's house that day to clean the chimney, so of course his shirt fibers could be there.
Yeah, that's a valid point. Just because his fibers were there doesn't mean he was there at the time of the murder.
It doesn't. But remember, forensic analyst John Evans was still hard at work examining McAnany's clothing. And in McAnany's jacket pocket, he found something else. A tiny paint chip.
Okay, but we've already dealt with a paint chip. What's so special about this one?
This paint chip, my friend, was a game changer. It looked like it could be from a house, and when Evans took a closer look, he noticed something familiar. This chip, too, had that distinctive three-layer structure. White on top, yellow in the middle, tan on the bottom.
You're kidding. So it's another paint chip sandwich. Did it match the other one?
You already know the answer. Evans carefully separated the layers and used infrared light to analyze the chemical makeup of each layer, and the results were clear as day. The chemical composition of the paint chip from McAnany's pocket was identical to the paint from Catherine's basement window and the chip found in her hand.
So not only did they find his fibers on Catherine, but now they've got a paint chip from the point of entry tucked away in his pocket. That's a pretty damning combo.
It was. But here's another interesting twist. Remember McAnany's cousin, Andrew Richmond, the one who was with him that day?
The alleged accomplice.
Right. Well, despite the suspicions surrounding his involvement, there was no forensic evidence tying him directly to the crime scene. The neighbor who saw someone running from the house couldn't positively identify him, and they didn't find any of his fibers or anything like that.
So even though they suspected he was involved, they couldn't prove it.
Exactly, which is why he was never charged. But there's one final piece of the puzzle that really solidified things for investigators. McAnany's cell phone records.
Ah, those pesky phone records always seem to trip people up.
They really do.
Yeah.
And in this case, McAnany's phone records showed 2 calls made to Catherine Bishop's home phone number on the night of the murder. One at 10:07 p.m. and the second just a minute later.
Right around the estimated time of death.
Exactly. Both calls were super short, 20 seconds and 10 seconds, and neither was answered.
What did the prosecution make of those calls?
They theorized that McAnany, having seen the cash earlier, decided to go back and try to steal it. He calls first, maybe hoping Catherine would be asleep or out, and when she doesn't answer, he goes in through the basement window, picking up those paint chips in the process.
And that's when he runs into Catherine.
Right. She's awake, a struggle ensues, which explains the defensive wounds, the fiber transfer, and the paint chip in her hand, and ultimately, McAnany kills her.
And his accomplice, presumably Richmond, panics and bolts out the side door, breaking the glass. Then they hightail it back to the bar to solidify their alibi before heading off to Atlantic City to blow their ill-gotten gains.
That's the theory. And while the Atlantic City trip was never definitively proven, the forensic evidence in those phone calls painted a pretty clear picture for the jury.
Hard to argue with those paint chips and fibers.
Especially when you add in that during his interrogation, McAnany, without even being asked about Richmond, says, "It's that effing beer. Every time I drink, I get in trouble."
Almost a confession right there.
It really is. So to wrap it up, Tim McAnany was tried and convicted of second-degree murder, robbery, and conspiracy. And after the verdict, he even tried to make a run for it, but was quickly caught. He's currently serving a life sentence.
What a wild ride. From chimney sweep to convicted murderer, all because of some tiny fibers and a paint chip.
It's a classic example of what they call barely visible evidence. It wasn't a smoking gun or a clear-cut eyewitness account. It was those seemingly insignificant details that ended up being the key to solving the case.
It just goes to show you, like that saying, every contact leaves a trace.
Exactly. And in McAnany's case, he left his trace all over the crime scene.
And those tiny traces led right back to him. It's a powerful testament to the importance of forensic science and those meticulous investigators who know how to look for those almost invisible clues.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? What other seemingly insignificant details in our everyday lives might hold hidden stories? What if we all just paid a little more attention?
It's like that saying, the devil's in the details.
Exactly. And sometimes those details can be the key to unlocking a whole lot more than we ever imagined. So folks, keep your eyes peeled and stay curious because you never know what you might find.